I'm Aiden, and I'm Dominican. Kind of.
My mom's side of the family is Dominican. Most of them are actually first generation immigrants to the US. My dad's side, though, is Italian and Lithuanian, and they've been in America for a lot longer. Throughout my life, I had always been present at various family gatherings, most of which were hosted by my mother's side.
These holidays were filled with various Dominican foods and Spanish salsa music and conversations between relatives filling the air. In fact, since many of my older relatives, like my grandma, are only fluent in Spanish, that's the language many of the conversations take place in. But me, I never learned Spanish. My mom never seemed intent on teaching me or my brother. I mean, I was practically raised by my grandma while my parents were working and before I was in school. And even she, despite not being very fluent, spoke to me in whatever English she could, despite my parents encouraging her to speak to me in Spanish and teach me the language.
So, with the specific details of this project in mind, I'm going to find out why.
And since I'm going home this fall break, I have a chance to do just that.
So, I hopped on a plane and flew back to New Jersey. As a small side note, I really enjoyed coming back home for the first time in so long, and I feel like I really needed this time to spend with my family after a while. My grandma even came over to say hi to me and my parents. But while I was enjoying my time back home, and after briefing my mom on what this project was all about, I sat her down for an interview.
All right, so I'm here to interview my mom. Could you tell us a little bit about, who you are and where you're from?
Yes, I am Elizabeth Velas Mascoli. I am Aiden's mom. I was born on June 2nd, 1966 in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. I came to the United States. I was about a year and a half old. It was post-war. It was right after the Dominican Civil War, which started in 1965. I came to the U.S. with my mom, my dad, and my older sister, who's a year older than me and was born right smack in the middle of the war. My parents emigrated to the U.S. in order to get a better life, have a better life for us. And it was a very complicated and a time of unrest for my country during that time. So they really wanted to escape Dominican Republic. I started school in kindergarten in Washington Heights. Washington Heights was an interesting part of Manhattan. Washington Heights is an area where many Dominicans emigrate to. And even today, it's still, even though it's a little bit more gentrified, it's still a very Dominican population. So it was a little easier for my parents to live in the Dominican, who were Dominican, to live in Washington Heights, where there were a lot of people like them.
I decided to start by asking my mom a little bit about how she learned English and what languages she was surrounded by growing up.
So you were speaking multiple languages at home, and you would naturally consider Spanish to be like your mother tongue. Do you consider English to be your first language now?
Actually, I do. I do consider English my first language. As a matter of fact, the way that I see it is I think in English and I translate to Spanish. I don't naturally think in Spanish and translate to English. And I think a big part of that had to do with the fact that I learned both languages at the same time.
So while you were growing up, was English commonly spoken in your home by your parents and your siblings?
Yes. Unlike other households, my parents did not exclusively speak to us in Spanish while we were learning Spanish. Because my dad learned English right away when he came to this country, they made an effort to speak to us in both languages while we were learning. My dad primarily spoke to us in English and my mom spoke to us strictly in Spanish. I think that gave us a little bit of an advantage. We didn't have as strong of an accent as other kids that emigrated. We also had the advantage of learning English very early, which I think was important.
So when you were speaking with your peers in your community in Washington Heights, was English commonly spoken then?
Yes. We mostly with our classmates, and Well, first we have to understand that Washington Heights is a very Latin area. So most of the children who I grew up with and went to school with were, even though there was diversity, many of them were both Dominican and Puerto Rican. At the time when we first came to this country, there was also a big Irish community in Washington Heights. Over time that diminished. Now Washington Heights is primarily Dominican, but it was a little bit more diverse. We even had a big Jewish population, which still exists in Washington Heights and some parts of Washington Heights. But for the most part, the kids that we hung out with were mostly Dominican, Puerto Rican, and bilingual. But I think that from what I remember, most of the kids that I spoke with and hung out with, it was mostly in English. But Spanish, the way that it worked, if you were around older adults that were speaking Spanish, you immediately switched to Spanish.
Mm. So, do you find yourself changing the way you speak or even the language that you're speaking depending on the people who are around?
All the time. And I don't think I do it consciously. I think it just happens very fluidly. Even at work, if I encounter a patient that I sense has a very strong Spanish accent, I'll find myself immediately switching to Spanish. It happens all the time around my older relatives who speak mostly Spanish. I immediately go to Spanish. It doesn't even register that I'm doing. It just happens automatically.
What my mom was just describing is called code switching. Code switching is defined as the process of shifting from one linguistic code, like a language or dialect, to another, depending on the social context or conversational setting. I found my mom's experiences regarding code switching to be especially interesting. In fact, after the interview, my dad told me that he often asked my mom to speak to him in Spanish, since he wanted to learn and practice the language, but she seldom would. She would always switch back to speaking English. And my dad explained that this frustrated him at first, but because of this discussion, he gained a new perspective. My mom would always recognize him as a native English speaker and instantly, even subconsciously, switch back to speaking English. And do you think your habit of switching languages originated from your community or your school or even back to when you were at home?
Definitely when I was at home. I remember when we were in a setting where I was just talking to my dad, I would speak to him in English and he would speak to us in English. But when we were in a group setting where my mom and my siblings and myself and my dad were around, we immediately switched to Spanish. So this switching back and forth from Spanish to English happened very quickly. Like we could be having dinner and we would be speaking Spanish, and all of a sudden, if we went to watch TV and I was with my dad and my siblings, we would switch to English. So this happened continually throughout the day.
So how did coming to America at such a young age affect your use of language and your cultural identity?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that I don't have any memory of really being in another country. I always thought this is my country. I don't remember emigrating or coming at age 1. I don't have memories of ever living in another country. So to me, I was learning 2 languages. I wasn't learning my language and another language. I was learning both my languages at the same time. I think that is a little different from maybe somebody who emigrates a little older to the United States. But my memories of learning language all happened simultaneously. It wasn't like we learned one language and then learned a second language. Both my languages were learned at the same time. So to me, in my mind, they are both my languages.
So has this ever caused you to feel like a dissonance between the languages that you speak and like the culture that you and your family are a part of?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Growing up, because I spoke both languages very well, I was teased sometimes. People would say, oh, my favorite one was, I'm a fake Dominican. I had a best friend for a long time who called me a fake Dominican. A, because I never really had a strong Spanish accent. And B, because in my mind, in my heart, I had 2 different cultures that worked together. It wasn't like I was one or the other. I feel both. But, you deal with it.
Since her childhood, my mother's experiences as a young immigrant learning 2 languages from a young age alienated her from other people inside her own community. Things like her accent and her proficiency in English caused her to stand out from other Hispanic people. I think it's really interesting that my mom had this kind of struggle because it's something that I can really relate to. I mean, I'm more light-skinned than most of my Hispanic family, and I don't eat a lot of the same foods that we cook at family dinners, and I don't even speak the same language. It's sort of comforting to know that my mom experienced these same struggles when she was someone who speaks the same language and is someone who eats the same foods and has a more similar skin tone to the rest of our family. This wasn't the only exclusion my mom felt throughout her life, though. She began to feel these things even more than ever when she moved to Albany for college after living her whole life in the more culturally diverse Manhattan. Her peers calling her a fake Dominican was replaced by actual racism from her white peers in college.
Hi, editing Aiden here. I was looking back at the video and I noticed that when I said actual racism, it kind of felt like I was undermining the discrimination that she experienced before college. That's not what I was trying to imply by that. What I was trying to stress was that the direction of this discrimination flipped from her being criticized for being not Dominican enough to now her being criticized for being too Hispanic in an area of white peers.
The racism my mother experienced in college could perhaps be another reason why she never taught her children Spanish. From the discrimination she faced, perhaps the only way out that she saw was to formalize her English. If she saw Spanish as a reason for the racism she experienced, and the Spanish she spoke wasn't good enough to fit in with other Latin people, then what reason would she have to teach that language to her kids?
So, how have you felt trying to maintain both of your languages, even while you are mostly speaking English?
It's interesting because I do get Spanish-speaking customers, patients, once in a while. But I tend to, and I don't think I do this consciously. I think it kind of just, there's a switch that goes off in your head. And if I have somebody who comes in and has a stronger Spanish accent and I sense that Spanish accent, I immediately switch to Spanish. It's incredible. I have an employee who actually speaks both languages just like myself, and her background's is very similar to mine. She, although was born here, she was born in Manhattan, but she really does spend a lot of time in Dominican Republic, a whole lot more than I do. When I go to Dominican Republic, and you know this, we're basically tourists. We don't really have a lot of family left in the Dominican Republic, whereas she does. She actually just finished building a house in the Dominican Republic. But she and I will be talking about something and we can immediately switch back and forth in the language, in both languages. It's interesting because her Spanish is very similar to my Spanish, where we kind of use a lot of Americanized terms that you wouldn't find if you spoke Spanish in the Dominican Republic. That tends to, there's a little bit of a difference in the language when you're speaking it in Dominican Republic and you're speaking it here. And I think the same thing happens to just about every single Spanish-speaking person from other countries. The Spanish that is spoken there in their native country is a little different from the Spanish that they speak here.
So you'd say that you do get enough experience and like practice speaking Spanish with like your families and your customers, and you've kind of found a way to incorporate it in your business that you are able to kind of not have to worry about maintaining it as much.
Not really. Sometimes I wish that I spoke it a little bit more. I think that's one of my life's failures is I didn't speak to my children as much as I should have. My children are not entirely bilingual, as you know. And it's probably one of my biggest regrets.
So were there any specific conditions that caused you to like not feel a need to pass down Spanish to my brother and me?
Yes. Now, I will reiterate that I literally feel regret and guilt over not teaching you and Julian Spanish the way that I should have. I think a big part of it has to do with the fact that Dad is Italian American, English speaking. And in my head, we were always speaking in English, so I didn't have that switch going to the Spanish speaking in the household. So because we weren't speaking Spanish in the household, immediately I just taught you guys English and spoke to you in English exclusively.
So there was like a sort of disconnect in your mind between, when you're trying to converse with other like Spanish speakers, fluent Spanish speakers, and people who like aren't fluent in the language.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's not that I'm consciously trying to do it to hurt anybody. I think it just happens subconsciously. You just automatically switch to the language that you feel they would be most comfortable in.
My mom's responses to these questions indicated two things for me. Firstly, code switching plays a large role in the ways my mother uses Spanish in her day-to-day life, and is probably a large reason why she remains proficient in the language today. I mean, she's even found ways to use it in her career. She uses it in her clinic to make her Spanish-speaking customers feel more comfortable. She explained in the interview that she specifically took legal Spanish courses in college so that in her previous finance job, she was able to explain terms and contracts in Spanish to Spanish-speaking clients and cater to a larger group of people. Secondly, code switching played a large role in the language my mom spoke in the household when me and my brother were growing up. In fact, this also brings another possible reason to the table. As I explained before, genetically or by blood or whatever you want to call it, I'm only half Dominican. And because of this and a little bit of random chance and maybe a lack of time in sunlight, I'm a lot lighter than a lot of my relatives on my mom's side. Because of all this new information in the interview, this made me think, what if my grandma saw me as more of a white person than a Dominican, and instinctively that made her speak to me in English? And what did my mom think? Did she think that because I was already white passing enough, what use would it be to teach me a language that would out me as not being white if I spoke it? That is, however, just a guess at what was going on in my mom's subconscious at the time. I mean, I guess I could ask her if that was a part of it. Do you think that could be a reason? Even like, I don't know.
Wait, I'm sure there's some truth to that. At least subliminally.
Right.
Regardless, I won't ever be able to change my mom's decision not to teach me Spanish when I was young. I may not have grown up surrounded by other Dominican people in Washington Heights, but at least I had those family get-togethers, right? I mean, there really were so many cultural experiences to enjoy there, like spending the day helping make pasteles before the holidays or dancing to salsa music in the middle of a restaurant. And it's not like I can't just start learning Spanish now. I mean, better late than never, right? I mean, I'm at Georgia Tech. I could take a course in Spanish if I didn't want to learn it on my own, and it fulfills a humanities requirement. And I'm sure my mom would help me learn the language if I needed it. She said herself that she wanted to when I was younger. So you know what? If my mom could come here at age 1 and learn 2 languages at once, grow up being too American for her Hispanic peers in high school and too Hispanic for her white peers in college, and somehow still manage to use her multilingualism to her benefit in her professional life, then I can manage to learn Spanish at some point during my years in college. And what better time to start than now?